and it's dark in here because I'd be blushing pretty strongly. Thank you very much, Jagmohan. Just before I start, I have two colleagues in the room who asked me to announce something that is part and parcel of this celebration of India that's going on this year. The Indian writers who are coming to Carleton on the 24th and 25th of October. That'll be from 4:30 to 6:30 in the Senate boardroom in Robertson Hall. And among the writers are people from the Sahitya Academy. They'll be presenting their works, and also there'll be discussions. So that's the 24th and 25th of October. And again, part of this great year of India in Canada that we're all celebrating. So thank you very much for giving me this invitation to talk about Gandhi. I'm also blushing. I told Dr. Pradeep Merchant that, he said, "You look nervous." And I said, "Well, I am, because normally I talk to 18-year-olds who know nothing about India. And this afternoon I'm addressing a room full of people who were born and lived and know a lot more about India than I do." So it's a daunting challenge. So what I want to do is share my reactions to seeing Bapu, seeing Gandhiji right here on the Carleton campus. And I'll give you my personal reflections. First of all, I'm thrilled. I'm very happy to finally see that statue appear, to get the darshan, so to speak, of that image. And I think we're all very happy that it's finally got a home here in Ottawa. However, I have to confess that the first thing that strikes me when I see it is how incongruous it is in many ways. Here's a brand new steel and glass and concrete building on a Canadian campus. What's this little middle-aged, partly naked, little man with glasses and a loincloth carrying a bamboo walking stick doing there? I mean, we have to, I think, be challenged by the incongruity of it all. Think about it. It is a little bit bizarre. And also think about a man wearing a dhoti come February when he'll be half covered in snow. So I like this quotation. The American scholar of religion, Jonathan Z. Smith, adapts a phrase from the French scholar Paul Ricoeur, who writes or observes, "It is the perception of incongruity that gives rise to thought." So let's think collectively about this image. We do need, I think, to confront this incongruity and turn incongruity into a confrontation, turn incongruity into a challenge, and be challenged individually by this image of Gandhi. So if you'll indulge my ruminations, what I'm going to do is just reflect on the statue as a Canadian, as a student of religions, and as a fairly novice student of the life and teachings of Gandhi. So first of all, I thought, well, maybe we need to ascertain what kind of an image this is. And I think maybe in the room is Dr. Harsha Deheja, who knows a lot more about this than I do. But the Hindu tradition in India has a variety of terms for various sorts of images. In Sanskrit, words like archa, pratima, murti, all of them have a more or less similar meaning. Is this statue a murti? No, I don't think so. Because a murti is a consecrated statue of a divinity in a temple or perhaps in a home shrine. If it were a murti, we would do not an unveiling, but an abhishekam. We would anoint the image. We would perform an act of unification and installation so that the divine presence would be literally installed in the image. They also use this expression, arch-avatara, the image incarnation of divinity. We might even paint in the eyes to enliven the statue, and we would do devotional puja rather than taking pictures, and we might wave oil lamps in the rite of arati. But this statue does not represent a divinity. It represents a mortal, a man, a very human being, but a man nonetheless who was absolutely extraordinary. A man who had his faults, he had his failings, he made mistakes, and sometimes Gandhi referred to his mistakes as Himalayan blunders. But nonetheless, as the ambassador, the High Commissioner from India said to us this afternoon, one of the greatest men in history. So what we've done, instead of doing an abhishekam in a temple, a mandir, we have done an unveiling. Well, what does that mean? Well, surely it means that we have lifted the veil and made something that was hidden now obvious or perceptible to us. So this is not the same thing as installing a deity in an abhishekam, but perhaps there are some overlaps between those two categories, because we have at least made Gandhi present to us, just as the abhishekam in the temple makes, in the view of some Hindu theology, the god present in the image. But I think to return to these Sanskrit terms, the one I might use for this statue of Gandhiji is alambana. That means a support, a prop, that serves as a support for the practice of meditation. So it is an object that can support the mind in becoming awake or mindful. So what does this Gandhi statue do in this regard? Well, it's quite simply a support that reminds us of Gandhian values, again, as President Rante and the High Commissioner reminded us. But I'll come to those values a little bit later. But thinking about this, I wanted to remind us of Gandhi's own attitude to his iconic representation. He found it, frankly, even more embarrassing than I found having Jagmohan read some of those student comments. He said in 1946, when he had heard that someone had erected a temple to him, the following statement. This appeared in Harijan in March 14th of 1946. He called making a Gandhi temple the grossest form of idolatry. And I quote from Gandhi, he said, "The person who erected the temple has wasted his resources by misusing them. The villagers who are drawn there are misled, and I am insulted in that the whole of my life has been caricatured in that temple. The meaning that I have given to worship is distorted. Worship of the charka, the spinning wheel, lies in plying it for a living, or as a sacrifice in ushering in Swaraj, or home rule. The Gita is worshipped not by parrot-like recitation, but by following its teachings. A man is worshipped only to the extent that he is followed, not in his weakness, but in his strength. Hinduism is degraded when it is brought down to the level of worship of the image of a living being. No man can be said to be good before his death. After death, too, he is good for the person who believes him to have possessed certain qualities attributed to him. As a matter of fact, God alone knows a man's heart. Hence, the safest thing is not to worship any person, living or dead, but to worship perfection, which resides only in God, known as truth." And I think that's a very typical viewpoint from Gandhi. So Gandhi warns against treating his image like a religious icon. But some modern commentators have also warned about another danger, which is to simply regard it as a cultural or national icon, to sort of be wheeled out on anniversary occasions like today, October the 2nd, or January 30th, the death anniversary, and paid only lip service to. This is a warning we get from Madhu Kishwar, the Center for the Study of Developing Societies in Delhi, who decries making Gandhi an icon if in so doing he is made an object only of pious platitudes. She writes very provocatively, and I quote, and I think you can see how provocative this is, "By making him a martyr, Godse, Natharam Godse, his assassin, helped Congress to set him aside, put him up on a meaningless pedestal, pay token tributes to his memory once or twice a year, and occasionally use his quotations in speeches delivered in international fora." She wrote that in Manushi in 2004. So, on the one hand, I don't think we should treat that statue as a murti, as a religious icon, but we should be challenged by it to do more than simply say, oh, there's Gandhi. Gandhi was a non-violent thinker, etc. So, what have we unveiled today? We've unveiled or uncovered a bronze image of a man dressed in a dhoti, carrying a walking stick. And so what is that supposed to mean? What is the message of this statue? What is the rationale behind setting it up next to Carleton's new river building? Well, let me state the obvious, and we've already heard this, that he's a renowned figure in global history. Gandhi is a figure so identified with India that, yes, he is almost the incarnation of Bharat Mata India, but he's also a figure of the world. He was steeped in the values of his upbringing in a Vaishnava household in Gujarat. He was taught by a Jain, but he also speaks clearly of the inspiration he got from the Sermon on the Mount in the Christian New Testament, and the inspiration he got from an Englishman, John Ruskin, an American, Henry David Thoreau, and a Russian, Count Leo Tolstoy. So yes, he belongs to India, but definitely to the world. And now I want to turn to something that is a group of four. And so I guess my subtitle for this talk is Encountering Gandhi on the Rideau River, but also thinking in clusters of four. And I'll come back to that when we look at the Center for Science, Technology, Trade, and Policy. That quaternity is something I reflected on. But I wanted to first turn to another group of four that Gandhi emphasized. This is what he called the four pillars of Swaraj, self-rule. And I'll quote you a short piece from him. This comes from Young India of 9 March 1922. He says, removal of untouchability, manufacture of Qadr, Hindu-Muslim unity, cultivation of non-violence are not measures of a temporary character. They are the four pillars on which the structure of Swaraj must forever rest. Take away any one of them, and it must topple down. The greater, therefore, the progress in these four matters, the nearer we are to Swaraj, and the nearer also to capacity for civil disobedience. So let me take a moment to talk about these four pillars, these four central components of his Swaraj program for a free India. And he alludes to the fact that these four overlap, and sometimes in his career he would emphasize one more than the other. And of course that produced controversy and sometimes alienated some of his followers. So when he would go too much on the matter of Hindu-Muslim unity, that sometimes alienated some of his Hindu followers. When he went too much in the direction of emphasizing Qadr, Qadi, local village economy, that sometimes alienated his great colleague Dr. Bhimrao Ambedkar, who said, no, the removal of untouchability should be the central preoccupation. But it shows how multifaceted Gandhi's program was. So let me just touch on these four pillars one by one. First of all, removal of untouchability. This is the liberty, fraternity, equality that Gandhi stressed. And I want to suggest, and I hope I'm going to in the rest of this talk, that Gandhi, his values resonate, I think, more today in some ways even than in his lifetime. And there are hopeful signs since his death that his ideas are taken seriously. So the removal of untouchability means the fundamental human rights of all human beings. And of course we've seen that in 1948, the year of his death, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of the United Nations. We've seen it much more recently in the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which finally this country, Canada, has signed on to. But obviously there's a lot more work to be done in this area, whether it's in India or in Canada. So today, October the 2nd, there's a march starting from Kanyakumari in the southern tip of India by a group called Ekta Parishad, and they'll walk thousands and thousands of kilometers in India campaigning for Adivasis, the tribal peoples, and all of the so-called depressed scheduled classes, including what Gandhi called Harijan or Dalit communities. Here in Canada, we've got the issue of our Indigenous peoples, First Nations. Carleton last week hosted Chief Sean Atleo of the Assembly of First Nations, who gave an excellent talk. But this remains an issue for not just Canada, but India. And I might say as an aside that if I fantasize about Gandhi not only visiting us here in Ottawa in the form of a statue, but if he could time travel and visit us in person, I wondered where he would stay. Well, I think he would probably stay not in Rockcliffe Park, not in the Glebe, maybe in Vanier, but most likely, I think, at the little Algonquin community of Barrier Lake, which is about 3 hours drive north of Ottawa. The Algonquin people were the traditional owners of this entire region, the Ottawa Valley. The Algonquins of Barrier Lake live on a little 50-acre reserve with no electrical hookup and not running water, 3 hours drive north of Ottawa. So I think that probably would be where Gandhi would go if he was to visit us today. But, we do see these developments, and so one of the most bizarre, but I think interesting developments recently is not only the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, but the recent declaration that came out of the country of Bolivia called Declaration of the Rights of Mother Earth, which says that not only should human beings have rights, but the other species should have rights. Even trees and rivers and ecosystems should have rights. And the very fact that this document has been produced and is gaining attention, I think, is, in my mind at least, a welcome development and something that Gandhi would embrace as well. The second pillar of Swaraj, he said, was Hindu-Muslim unity. But I would expand that in terms of Gandhian values to have that refer to amity between religions and ethnicities, language and cultural groups. And we all know, I think, that Gandhi was such a pioneer in this process. So pluralism, diversity, multiculturalism, these words have already been mentioned. Certainly the dialogue between religions post 9/11, my teacher Arvind Sharma in Montreal just had a conference on that topic a few weeks ago, is gathering steam. And we're all searching for a dialogue between civilizations rather than a clash between civilizations, and Gandhi, again, is a huge inspiration in that arena. The third pillar of Swaraj, Gandhi said, was khadi. Hand-spun, hand-woven cotton. But by that, I mean that includes the whole small-scale village industry that he championed. I would refer that, if I would broaden this category, to apply to things like appropriate technology, solar panels, LED light bulbs. Here on this campus, we've had engineering students work with Engineers Without Borders to put little solar panels and LED reading lights in villages in developing countries so school children can read. The whole matter of walking lightly and respectfully on the earth, I would locate under that Gandhian category of khadi and village economy. But I think one of the turns that we've seen in our culture that I think is also very Gandhian in this regard is the local food movement, the slow food movement, the organic food movement, things like microcredit in villages, the grassroots empowerment of women in villages, the whole notion of sustainability whereby economic activity should not leave a legacy of depletion or environmental disaster for subsequent generations. So that is very Gandhian. And finally, we come to the fourth, ahimsa, or non-violence, which Gandhi said was, in a sense, the master component of this list. I won't go on about that. We all, I think, know how important that was to him. But, of course, it acquires a new urgency in the era of nuclear weapons. Obviously, very important here also is Gandhi's great contribution of the method of non-violent resistance. So if I think again about Gandhi visiting Ottawa, if Gandhi was in town last week, I'm certain that he would have been last Monday on Parliament Hill joining the protest against the pipeline to take bitumen down from the Alberta tar sands to Texas. Now, obviously that's a big debate as to whether that should go ahead or not, but and there are sides to that debate, but I'm certain where Gandhi would have been had he been there. I was there. It was a very civil disobedience, very Gandhian, very Canadian, I guess, in its restraint. But I think it's again a sign of that Gandhian ethos. So I want to now talk about some other groups of 4 before getting to the center, which is housed in the new building on the river. So one of the curiosities about Indian civilization is that it has a predilection, you might say, for clusters or groups of 4s. Actually, 3 plus 1 equals 4. So let me mention a few of those. One of them would be the 4 ashramas, the 4 stages of life, where you have the student, the householder, the forest dweller, and then the 4th one, the renouncer, the sannyasin, of which Gandhi was in a sense one. Then you have the 4 states of consciousness: waking consciousness, that I hope we all are in the room right now, dreaming consciousness, the state of deep sleep, and then they posit a 4th one, turiya, pure consciousness. Then you have the 4 varnas, Brahmana, Kshatriya, Vaishya, and Shudra, the priests, the rulers, the merchants, and a 4th, who are those 3, the first 3 are so-called twice-born, and then the 4th, the Shudra, the servant. And then you have the 4 purushartha, the 4 aims of life: pleasure, kama, prosperity, artha, duty, dharma, but then a 4th one is added, moksha, or liberation. So that set me thinking about the 4 components of the new Center of Excellence to be housed in the River Building. And I want to get to that, but I can't help but making a little totally irrelevant interjection for a moment. You may or may not know that in 1950, Pope Pius XII announced officially the dogma that the Blessed Virgin Mary was assumed bodily into heaven. That created a great stir in the Protestant world because they said, well, that has no biblical warrant. But there was one Protestant who celebrated this teaching, and that was the Swiss-German psychologist Carl Gustav Jung, who said, oh, finally, the Christian Trinity has moved from a trinity to being the perfection of a quaternity. So that may be something that you find in Hindu tradition. We get this 3 plus 1, where you have the 3 plus 1 sort of strange one, which is transcendent to the other 3, but is somehow supposed to govern the first 3. So if you take the 4 purusharthas, that is kama, artha, dharma, moksha, moksha is the highest, the goal of spiritual liberation, but the governing one, the 4th, really is dharma, because dharma, righteous duty, should dictate how one pursues the other 3 aims of life. So, in a very long-winded way, I hope this brings me to the India-Canada Centre for Excellence in Science, Technology, Trade, and Policy. Here's another strange cluster of 4. 3 of them I would want to group together, but the 4th one I would argue is policy. But more on that in a moment. But again, when I think about this, I have to admit, struck by a certain incongruity, because if any of you know anything about Gandhi, you know that Gandhi had certain suspicions about science, certain suspicions about technology, certain suspicions about trade, and certainly many suspicions about government policy. So I think we have to again deal with that challenge. So, first of all, science. In fact, Gandhi did not have a problem with science. He was a great admirer of Jagdish Chandra Bose, the great Indian physicist, and Albert Einstein famously said that, in future generations, humans will scarce believe that such a one as Gandhi ever walked upon the earth. So Gandhi didn't really single out science as a problem. But what about technology? Well, if you've read Hind Swaraj, his great tract written on the way back from one of his visits to Britain, you know that he's very hostile, in a sense, to a confidence in technology for technology's own sake. Trade, well, what is Kadi and Swaraj about but breaking the monopoly of British textiles in India? So again, Gandhi is not necessarily against trade, but he's very much for a just and fair trade in the world. So I think that leads us then to saying, well, out of this group of four, perhaps policy is the transcendent fourth, because I think from a Gandhian point of view, science, technology, and trade are not unambiguous intrinsic goods in and of themselves. It's how you use science, how you use technology, and how you use trade that matters. So I want to just share with you one quotation, and I should end off relatively soon, from Gandhi. It's probably one many of you have heard many times before. It was found by his secretary, Pyarilal Nair, after Gandhi's death in 1948, and it was probably one of the last things Gandhi ever wrote. It's quoted very often. If you go to the Birla House, in Delhi, the site of the assassination, you can see it inscribed on a stone in the garden next to Birla House. So Gandhi writes the following, and I think this to me is the bottom line from Gandhi, if we're going to think in a nutshell about Gandhi on policy. So Gandhi wrote, "I will give you a talisman. Whenever you are in doubt or when the self becomes too much with you, apply the following test. Recall the face of the poorest and the weakest man whom you may have seen and ask yourself if the step you contemplate is going to be of any use to him. Will he gain anything by it? Will it restore him to a control over his own life and destiny? In other words, will it lead to Swaraj, freedom, for the hungry and spiritually starving millions?" So I think Gandhi is absolutely clear on this. Policy, at the end of the day, must be policy directed to the poorest, the oppressed, the most vulnerable members of society. In the biblical parlance of the Hebrew Bible, the widows and the orphans in their affliction. And so a good policy is one that helps the poorest of the poor, and a policy that contributes to a growing gap between rich and poor, which we see both in Canada and in India, is not a good policy. And I think this is something that's pretty clear from Gandhi, and maybe something that the statue may help to remind us. So I think I have a few more minutes, and I want to say, that I've mentioned that I find this statue incongruous, but very welcome. I also did a bit of a thought experiment in thinking about where is Gandhi going on the campus? Well, he's walking away from that steel and glass and concrete building. He's turned his back to it. But I don't think that means that Gandhi is saying you have to reject steel and glass and high-tech buildings and electricity and so forth, because where's he going? Well, you'll notice he's walking towards the O-train tracks. We all know in this country we need more trains and more public transit. But there's also something that struck me about where Gandhi is going. You may not know, but last summer and the summer before, there were archaeological digs that happened on the Rideau River directly across from the river building and just downstream from where that trestle bridge goes across the river. And what was found there was an Aboriginal encampment with artifacts dating to 1,000 before the Common Era. So 3,000-year-old campsite of indigenous peoples. They would probably come down the Rideau River, portage around the Hogsback Falls, and then camp on the river facing the Carleton campus. And the reason the archaeological dig happened last summer and the summer before was that the National Capital Commission had an old report of Aboriginal artifacts being found on the bank of the Rideau River. And so when they were doing construction on the railway bridge, the NCC insisted that the contractor who needed to lift up part of the bicycle path bring in an archaeologist to look for stuff, and stuff was found. And to me, that's an extremely interesting and exciting development, that there's a 3,000-year-old encampment right opposite the Carleton campus. And I think that's one of the places that Gandhi is walking to. You know? So I would see him as a sort of mediator between the high-tech building with its steel, its glass, its concrete, its center for the study of science, technology, trade, and policy, and this idea that maybe we have to, as a society, reconnect with nature, reconnect with what indigenous peoples have to offer, and that's one of the directions that Gandhi is leading us when we look at his statue. I think, lastly, I feel when I look at the Gandhi statue a certain sense of condemnation. I take it as a judgment on me. Now, that may be my Christian upbringing, where in I think several places in the New Testament, Jesus says to his followers, deny yourself, sell all that you have and give to the poor, pick up your cross and follow me. Well, this is an impossible challenge. It's a kind of judgment. And so it makes anyone who reads that extremely uncomfortable. And I think for me, and maybe this is my sort of projection from my upbringing onto confronting the Gandhi statue, there is, though, this sense of what does Gandhi do? He challenges us, he confronts us with this complete inversion of worldly values. Most of us pursue, kama and artha, that is pleasure and well-being and maybe even power, not so much dharma and moksha, but Gandhi inverts all those worldly values, and he says, I've become a bungi, I've become a sweeper, and he would stay in the sweeper colony in Delhi when he visited, except at the end when, for protection, he needed to go to Birla's mansion. But I think it is important that we be challenged by Gandhi, but not paralyzed by the high bar that he sets for our behavior, and so that challenge is not a judgment so much as an inspiration. So I'll end with this conclusion. At first glance, the statue of Mahatma Gandhi on our campus appears incongruous. But this perception of incongruity should not be avoided. It should be transformed into the challenge of being confronted by Gandhian values. And being confronted with Gandhian values, if you're like me, you feel tried in the balance and found wanting. But as I say, I think the statue should be more than a source of discomfort, more than a source of judgment. It also is and should be a source of inspiration. And I've tried to show that despite personal or societal failings to even approach Gandhi's standards of nonviolence, voluntary simplicity, and commitment to the poor, there are nonetheless some signs, very positive, very hopeful signs of a cultural turn in the direction of his values. Such signs are found in this country, in India, and indeed in the world. Thank you very much.